Hey everybody, it's another time for us to read. So I'm going to quickly review what we're trying to do here. All right. So because we had done this already, I want to remind you about what good readers do. Good readers ask questions before, during, and after reading. Good readers ask who, what, where, when, why, and how questions to ask about the characters, the setting, the events, the cause and the effect, the problem, the solution. All of those things are important to remember about a story. And again, if you're reading nonfiction, you're reading to find facts about the topic, the main idea. And lastly, as you're reading and you're asking these questions, you also want to answer them for yourself. So that's what I want you to remember to do as we're doing this. So, quick run through of the titles of the books that we read by our author, Patricia Polacco. Thunder Cake by Patricia Polacco, with a grandmother and a little girl who learns to be brave. Babushka's Doll by Patricia Polacco, again with a grandmother and a little girl who learns to be kind and patient. Thank You, Mr. Falker, with a little girl and a teacher. And the little girl learns that she actually can read, and it's something that she's very capable of doing with the right help. Then we read My Rotten Red-Headed Older Brother, about a sister and brother, little girl and a boy, who didn't really get along very well. They learned that they could be friends. And then The Junkyard Wonders, with a little girl and a bunch of classmates who learned how they were special in their own unique way. And finally, we read Chicken Sunday, where the children learned something very biblical. They learned that even when someone is not happy with you or they're angry at you, you can do things to try and help them to be friends and to heal the relationship. So, and again, we're always looking at the who, the where, the what, the why, and the how. But we're also looking to compare and contrast. So yesterday I asked you to compare and contrast The Junkyard Wonders and Chicken Sunday. Today we're going to compare and contrast Chicken Sunday with Mrs. Katz and Tush. This is our new book. Now, I want you to remember, we also talked about author's purpose, and we said that was to persuade or convince you to agree with me. Inform, which is to teach you something, to tell you something that maybe you didn't know, or to entertain, which means for you to enjoy it. So we're going to read Mrs. Katz and Tush, and we're going to look for ways that we can compare and contrast. So if we look at the covers of both books, we can see that there's a little boy this time and an older adult woman. So both books, we've already seen some way that they're the same, that we can compare them. But we're going to continue and look at ways that other ways that they're the same, or maybe ways that they're different. Okay? So here we see, he doesn't look like he's enjoying this, but this is a mother, his mother, I assume, we'll read as we're looking at it, and this older woman, and they're sitting in what looks like her house maybe, or her apartment. So let's find out what's going on, okay? Larnell didn't know Mrs. Katz very well, but almost every other day his mother stopped in to see her after work. Since her husband died, she's so alone, his mother told him. Mrs. Katz held tight to his mother's hand the day they looked at an old photo album. That's what's in her photo album, which I don't know if we have many of those these days, but it was a book with photographs of people in your family, friends, and events, kind of like Instagram, but in a book. Mrs. Katz, oh, I'm sorry. That's my husband Myron, said Mrs. Katz. He came from Poland, like me, a long time ago. We had such a life, such a life. Then her voice broke. We had no children, and I'll be all alone for Hanukkah and Passover. Again, this is a Jewish celebration. Hanukkah and Passover are parts of the Jewish tradition. In the Christian tradition, we don't really celebrate them. Then she cried. Although we did do a Passover Seder when we drank our wine and ate our bread. So there's Larnell looking like he's a little bit uncomfortable. The next day, Larnell stopped in to see her himself. There he is. "I've been thinking," he said. "A cat had some kittens in the basement of our building. We found someone to take them all except this one. She's the runt." Runt means small, the smallest of the group. "Nobody wants her because she is so ugly. She doesn't even have a tail." So in a way, even though Larnell is not a real good friend with this woman, he knows that she's lonely based on what he's seen. So in his mind, he's thinking, maybe I can help her out. Do you remember in Chicken Sunday? Just want to remind you. Was there someone who was kind of lonely? Think about it. "Ugly, you say," Mrs. Katz said. "My Myron was ugly, too." Now remember, Myron was her husband when he was little. But he grew up to be such a person. Mrs. Katz looked at the little kitten. "Scrawny little Boobala." Boobala is a Yiddish word for baby. "So small. No tail," she said as she examined the kitten closely. "I don't know," she said doubtfully. Then she saw the look on Larnell's face. "Larnell, I'll take her," she announced, "but only if you'll come and help me with her. I've never had a cat before." Larnell promised. "A good Yiddish name I'll give her," which is the language that people in the traditional Hebrew community use, said Mrs. Katz. "Let's see. She has no tail. All you see is her tush," which, if you take the context, actually means her behind. "That's it. We'll call her Tush." Little Tush grew healthy and strong. Mrs. Katz cooked for her, brushed her, knitted toys for her, and even read to her. "Such a person," she'd say as she watched Tush play. Mrs. Katz was in love. See, all those people that are shut in for COVID-19 that take care of themselves, they're also out getting pets. And of course, I got a lot of company with my dog and my couple cats. And actually Dash is here too, in case you were wondering. And Spike. Larnell kept his promise. He visited Mrs. Katz and Tush every day after school. There was always a fresh baked kugel, which is a kind of cake, and a tall glass of milk waiting for him. But as much as he grew to love Tush, he also loved to listen to Mrs. Katz talk about the old country and the way times used to be. "I come from Warsaw. That's in Poland, you know. I came here to work, sewing dresses in the garment district for my cousin Moisha. I didn't speak one word of English." "Then how did you talk to people?" asked Larnell. "I didn't," she answered. "A lot. I cried in those days, until I met Myron. He asked me to marry him after he tasted my kugel." "I believe that," Larnell said as he ate some. "Myron and I used to vacation in the Catskills, a borscht resort, you know, a place for Jews to stay." "You mean Jews couldn't stay anywhere they wanted to?" Larnell asked. See, they're enjoying, there's Tush, and there's the cake and some tea. Sounds like another one. Mrs. Katz didn't answer. Instead, she went to a trunk and pulled out some old clothes. "My grandma told me about places she couldn't stay either," Larnell said. So, because she was Jewish, there were certain places that Jewish people weren't allowed to stay. And as you know, based on what we learned about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and Rosa Parks, there were places that Black people and brown people couldn't stay either. Larnell, your people and mine are alike, you know. Trouble we've seen. Happiness, too. Great strength we've had. You and I are alike. So much alike. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, the Catskills. We used to dress every Sunday and have a costume ball, said Mrs. Katz. Then she put a record on the record player. I know you guys don't know records. The record players, you got streaming music and all that. But back in the day, there was something called a record player, and there were things called records. And we used them. There might actually be a resurgence of that. We're seeing more and more people getting records again. It was old and scratched. You hear that, Larnell? She said. That is what we used to dance to. It's a dance from my homeland. Here, I'll show you. They whirled around the room and laughed and giggled. As the weeks passed, Larnell spent more and more time with Mrs. Katz. Looks like they're becoming really good friends, doesn't it? Since you are almost family to me, Larnell, she said one day, I want you should come with me to say Kaddish for my Myron. I know you're not Jewish, but Myron would have liked you. You're such a person, Larnell. At the cemetery, she read from her book. Then she asked Larnell to put a small rock on top of Mr. Katz's headstone. So you see there's rocks on these headstones, and that's a tradition. You go and visit the cemetery, visit people that are buried there, family and loved ones that you want to share time with, and so you would read to them and then put a stone or a rock on top of their tombstone. We do this to remember, she said softly. Shalom, my Myron. Shalom. That's a greeting for people in the Jewish tradition, she murmured and wiped tears from her face. On the way home, she announced, Kugel, such a kugel I baked for you today, Larnell. Hurry, Tush will be worried for us, she said as they walked. When they got home, they called and called for Tush, but she didn't come. They looked everywhere for her. Suddenly, Mrs. Katz gasped. The window to the fire escape was open. Ooh, and you remember this? The menorah we learned about when we were talking about traditions, Christmas time traditions, when we were talking about places in the world. Oh, no, she cried. I forgot to shut the window before I left. Poor Boobala. She has never been outside. We'll find her, Larnell tried to reassure her. She has been acting strange lately, Mrs. Katz said through her tears. She has been trying to get out, but I was afraid after that she would get hit by a car. I'll find her, Mrs. Katz, Larnell said. I won't let you down. So you can imagine how Mrs. Katz is feeling right now? We could ask, what is she feeling? And now there's a problem. The cat's missing. How are they going to solve that problem? It was getting dark. First, Mrs. Katz and Larnell looked around their building. Then they went everywhere in the neighborhood. They left notes on doors, telephone poles, and fences. They asked everyone who lived nearby. But no one had seen little Tush. That night it stormed. There was rain, awful, awful rain. Mrs. Katz hardly slept as she thought about her poor little Katala, which means little cat. She's such a person, she whispered. Larnell worried most of the night, too. What will Mrs. Katz do, he thought. Please, God, bring that little cat back, he said softly into his pillow. A loud knock on the front door awoke Mrs. Katz. It was Larnell's father and two of the neighbors. Is this yours? They asked. My Boobala, my little Katala, Mrs. Katz exclaimed. We found her in the back alley, soaking wet and hungry, Mr. Moore said. Thank you, Mrs. Katz said, as she took Tush in her arms. After a while, Tush no longer had the least desire to go outside again, but she slept a lot, even when Larnell came over to play with her. What do you notice about her? Anything? Does she look different in some way? It was my Aunt Havila's Passover Seder that I met Myron. Did you know that? Mrs. Katz asked as she looked at Larnell. What good times they were, with lots and lots of family. Now it's just me, she said softly. Could I have Passover dinner with you? Asked Larnell. I thought you would never ask, she exclaimed as she hugged him close. Such a Seder I'll prepare for you. Passover is a time for good food, Mrs. Katz shouted as they edged their way through the crowd in the deli. Like your people, my people were slaves too. And remember in the Bible that Moses had to go to Egypt to free the people who were being enslaved. They lived in a country where they didn't want to be. They wanted freedom so much that they prayed to God to help them. So he sent an angel that brought death and sadness to the houses of our captors. But the angel did not visit the house of my people. How did the angel know where the Jews lived? Larnell asked. They marked their doors. Then the angel passed over. Passed over, Larnell. That's why we call this time of celebration Passover. So, Larnell, we have a big feast to celebrate, but we also remember those who had to suffer so we could be free, Mrs. Katz said. Part of the dinner is sad, and part is happy. So there's all the tasty foods that they're getting. As Larnell helped get out the linens and china, Mrs. Katz said, You see this tablecloth? This was our wedding chuppah, our canopy. For all these years we have used it for holy days and celebrations. How come you have so many different dishes? Larnell asked. Because some Jews don't eat dairy and meat off of the same dishes, she answered. So that means you don't eat cheese with beef, so you would eat a cheeseburger. You don't eat macaroni and cheese with bacon in it or anything like that. Okay. When they sat down to Seder together, Mrs. Katz lit 2 candles and waved her hands over them. She read from her book, said prayers, then smiled and said, Let the feast begin. They drank red wine and water. They ate bitter herbs, lamb, and chicken. We would have done something similar to this if we had been in school to do our Passover. They also had gefilte fish and spicy chopped apples and potato pancakes. This bread looks like a soda cracker, Larnell exclaimed. We call it matzah, dear. We eat it at Passover. It's flat because there is no yeast in it, so it doesn't rise like bread. Larnell, I have hidden one piece of the matzah here in the apartment. If you can find it, I have a surprise for you. And that's something that traditionally that Jewish families do on Passover is they hide a piece of matzah for the children to look for. The surprise was a hand-knit sweater that she made just for him. The next day, Mrs. Katz yelled out her back window to Larnell's apartment. Come quick! Already! Something wonderful! Larnell and his mom and dad rushed to her door. The angel of death passed over, but the angel of life didn't. Mazel tov, Tush! 4 babies. At last I am a booby, which is babushka for short. So that's why Tush looked so funny. Tush was about to have some babies. As the years passed, Mrs. Katz, Tush, and her descendants became part of Larnell's family. There were graduations, weddings, new babies, and finally a Kaddish. Now, do you remember what Kaddish was earlier in the book? It's a time of saying prayers at somebody's graveside. Larnell stood in front of the headstone. He'd read from her book. He placed a small rock on top of her headstone. Then he, his wife, and their children read the inscription together. Mrs. Katz, our Bubby. Such a person. That's the end. So, you can think about what happened. Why did it happen? How did, there was a couple problems. There was the problem of Mrs. Katz's loneliness, and that was solved by getting a cat. And then there was the problem of the cat being lost, but that was solved by the cat being found, and it turned out the cat had gone out and decided that she was going to have babies. So the questions that you want to ask yourself is how are these two books? And I'm going to remind you about the other book, Chicken Sunday and Mrs. Katz and Tush. You might begin to see some things that are the same. You might begin to see some things that are different. I'm going to let you think about it. The nice thing is that if you need to rewatch one of the videos to help you, you can do that to remind you of how Chicken Sunday went and how Mrs. Katz and Tush went. So I will, excuse me, I'm sorry. I will make the graphic organizer available for you, and you'll be able to submit it when you get it finished. And I hope that you've learned a lot from these books by Patricia Polacco. They were there to entertain, but they're also there to help us appreciate about friendships and family and caring for each other. I have another book that I'm going to read to you by Patricia Polacco, and it'll actually illuminate a little bit about Mrs. Katz and Tush. So I wish you a good rest of this day, and thank you for working so hard on doing all this work and learning all these new concepts. All right, bye.